بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتاب الكريم والفرقان المجيد يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. My dear Muslim brothers and sisters, welcome to today's class. Inshallah, I have been requested to talk about Islamic inheritance today. We're doing this via YouTube live streaming, so we thought it's apt that we use modern technology. We have got a lot to cover today, so I'm not going to make any apologies on that. Anyone who thought they're going to be able to come in and go through a nice talk about how Islam defines inheritance, this is not what you're going to get. What you're going to get is inshallah, what you're going to get is a good understanding of what the Islamic laws are, of what the English law is, and of what the English tax regulations are with regards to Islamic wills. So inshallah, without any further ado, let me just get stuck straight into the course material. So let's start straight from the beginning, inshallah. Islamic inheritance. The objectives of this course. So this is normally a 3 to 6 hour course, but I understand everyone's time pressured, so I'm going to condense this into 1 hour for you. So we're going to go through this quite quickly. We're going to cover it at quite a superficial level. We're not going to go into the detail because we don't have the time for that. If anyone does want to have a detailed course where we go through each slide at a time and you make sure you understand each slide, then I'm more than happy to be able to do that. But the objectives of the course, first and foremost, is to bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the motivation behind many of us for doing this, and that's the primary objective, to bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second objective here is to make significant savings in legal fees and inheritance tax liability. So I estimate at the end of this course, if you were to get a solicitor to do this work for you, it would cost you between £1,000 and £3,000. Now, you can do all this legal work on your own. In fact, the government encourages you to do this work on your own. It wants to get lawyers and accountants to do more of the complicated tasks. But some of this basic administrative work, it wants you to do it on your own. There's many self-help videos on gov.uk, which I have included links to, which tell you how to go about doing this on your own. And there's many helplines that you can use and lots of advice there, because this is all about getting lawyers and accountants to stop doing basic administration work and doing more complex work, and letting citizens like you and I do some of the basic legal work. So I estimate between £1,000 and £3,000 saving in legal fees if you would at the end of this course. Your inheritance tax liability as well. Say the average Londoner has £500,000 in assets. If your children were to inherit this and you were to have the £325,000 tax threshold on you, that would mean anything above £325,000 would have a 40% tax liability. So what that would mean effectively is if you have assets of about £500,000 and you die, your children, your inheritors, will end up paying about £70,000 in tax. And inshallah, I'm going to offer you a solution, which means that £70,000 can be reduced to zero. So significant savings that I think anyone would experience if they go through this course in terms of being able to avoid the inheritance tax, which is probably going to hit most people who are high earners or who live in London. The third objective about this course is that you learn about the Islamic rules of inheritance. And I think there's two things that will surprise everyone. One is that there is a difference between a will and what Allah has stipulated needs to be inherited to different people. The second thing is when you figure out where your inheritance is going to go, where the money that you leave it when you die is going to go, I think some of you will be surprised and maybe even unhappy about some of the places where it will go. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to accommodate. And, you know, to give you an example of that, Some of you might not know that if you were to die, your wife will get very little. Your son will probably get the most. Your daughters after that. Your parents will get a significant sum, and then least of all will go to your wife. So you have a problem. What happens, when you die, you don't want your wife to be poor, and it could even mean that she wouldn't have anywhere to live. So what can we do about that? The fourth thing we want to do is we want to produce a draft will. We want to produce a will, and this will should be compliant to the Sharia, so you're not sinful. It should be compliant to the UK law, so it's enforceable, and it should minimize your tax liability, so you shouldn't be paying any tax. These are the three things that we want from that will, and inshallah at the end of this course you should have a will that does all these three things. The fifth thing we want to do in this course is, I don't know if anyone has thought about lasting power of attorney, but you need to have provision that if you are to die, that somebody, if you were to become incapacitated, you disappear, or you become in a persistent vegetative state, that somebody can make decisions about your health and your wealth. And this is one of those things that's certainly done better sooner rather than later. If you go to a lawyer, they will charge you anything from £300 to £1,000 to do this. I can show you how you can do this yourself for free. And it's just, it's not complicated at all, but it's an important thing to do. We'll then go through some of the options around inheritance tax planning. If you do want to set up a trust that is in your wife's name, there's things that you need to do about your property, making sure that it's a tenancy in common, not a joint tenancy. And again, I can talk you all through the process of how you do that yourself, saving you hundreds of pounds in conveyancing costs. And then the last thing that is the objective of this course, so we've got the getting close to Allah, we've got saving the money, we've got the minimizing the tax liability. But so many times we've seen disputes when somebody passes away that people end up fighting with each other. Sometimes people wrongly take money that they think belongs to someone else, and there's a lot of fitna. This fitna comes because when the person dies, there's ambiguity. Well, they make a broad statement and say, oh, just everything according to the Sharia, not realizing what that means. And we want to minimize that ambiguity so there isn't that kind of debate. So inshallah, when you pass on, when you die, the people who remain behind can focus on worshipping Allah and asking for your forgiveness rather than bickering amongst themselves. So these are the objectives, inshallah, of the course. This is just the kind of things that we'll go through. The course content, we'll fly through this because we're already running out of time. So let's talk about why is this important. Well, there's a great hadith from Jabir bin Abdullah. He said he felt really, really sick and he was in and out of consciousness. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ came to him and poured water on him and he regained consciousness. And then he said, "O Allah, O Messenger of Allah, what do you command with regard to my wealth? What shall I do? Because I'm in and out of consciousness." He had lots of female dependents on him and he wanted to know what to do with his wealth. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ remained silent, and then these ayat of Quran, Surah 4, ayat number 11 and 12 and many others were revealed. Now the interesting thing is that everything we're going to cover today is taking these ayat number 11 and 12, and just exploring them in more depth. And inshallah you'll appreciate the miracle of the Quran at a new level, because you're going to see how these two ayat, which many of us probably read without thinking, actually create such a complex and intricate, detailed system that requires an advanced level of thinking to be able to understand. So it's just these two ayat of Quran will spawn this fantastic new field. So inshallah we'll experience that. And I'd like you to reflect at the end of this course on those two ayat of Quran and say, wow, those two ayat of Quran created all of this. Why is it important? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in ayah number 13 and 14. In ayah 13, Allah says, these are the limits. After telling us what the inheritance should be, Allah says, these are the limits set by Allah. Whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will be admitted by Him into gardens of paradise. Then Allah says in ayah number 14, whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger and transgresses His limits, Allah will put him into fire to abide eternally therein, and he will have a humiliating punishment. So remember these two ayat of Quran, especially when you see what the inheritance looks like and you might be unhappy with certain things. You do not get a choice over this. You do not get a choice over the Islamic portion of the inheritance that wealth belongs to Allah, and Allah has commanded this is how it is distributed, and you are simply being tested on whether you will distribute it in that way or not. So you cannot exercise your own judgment over the Islamic inheritance part, but you can exercise it over something called wasiyah, which is a third of your wealth, which inshallah I'll explain later on. There is also the famous hadith of Umar ibn Khattab. He says, "It is the duty of a Muslim who has anything to bequeath not to let 2 nights pass without writing a will about it." Abdullah ibn Umar, his son, said, "When I heard this hadith, I didn't even pass 1 night without having my will with me." The Messenger of Allah also said, "A man may do good deeds for 70 years, but then he acts unjustly in his will, and the wickedness of his deeds comes on him and he enters the fire. Another man, he acts wickedly for 70 years, but his last will and testament is good, and on him he enters the garden." So it is really important that you get this will correct. And there's many other verses of Quran and many other hadith that talk about this. But this is why it's important. The other reason why it's important is that in pre-Islamic times, the Arabs used to say that only those who fight or who ride horses or who capture booty are entitled to inherit. And when the laws of inheritance came, it created a new era of women and children inheriting wealth. So this created a new frontier in civil rights and equality for for minorities. It also spawned 2 great mathematical fields. So Al-Jabr, many of you may have heard of Al-Khwarizmi, the great mathematician, Muslim mathematician who died 235 years after Hijrah. His book, Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, here he talked about developing algebra to solve the problem of Islamic inheritance. Could he talk about 2 portions here, 3 portions here, 4 portions here? So that's why he developed algebra to solve this problem. And Al-Hasar, in the 6th century, he developed the line that separates the numerator and the denominator and fractions to be able to help with the inheritance. So what has this ended up with? We have ended up with, as was said by Professor Al-Mariq Rumzi, that this Islamic laws on inheritance comprises beyond question the most refined and elaborate system of rules for the devolution of property in the civilized world. It has created this science called the Ilm al-Fara'id, the science of the ordained quotas. These 2 simple ayat of Quran, and that's what we'll go through. So in summary, why is it important? Because if you don't do it, you'll be sinful. There'll be fitna when you die. And if you don't do it, your wealth will be passed according to the state. It will be passed away interstate. And this means it's passed according to English law, which is very different to Islamic law. So let's talk about the pillars of a will. Let's talk about the pillars of a will. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, and there is evidence for each one of the points that is made here, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. But effectively, you have 5 elements within the Islamic will. You have the al-Musi, who is the testator, which is you or I, the person who's making the will. We have the will, which is written down. Now, there's an important point about the will. The will is, so what we do is we take away all your debts and all the money, all the stuff that you owe people, and we take all that away, and that leaves your net wealth. Then from your net wealth, you can give up to 1/3 of that to whomever you choose. But that whomever you choose can't be someone who's entitled to inherit it under Sharia, so your son can't be a part of that. That up to 1/3 can be to whoever you decide, and that is effectively al-wasiyah. That is your will, al-wasiyah. Then after al-wasiyah, that 2/3 then, that goes to what Allah talked about in ayah number 11 and 12. It goes to your wife, your children, your parents, your cousins, your grandchildren, and so forth. So that is the difference between the wealth you have when you die, your wasiyah, which is your will, and then that money which is distributed according to the Sharia. The wasiyah, so you might say, so that 1/3 of your wealth, you might say that you want it to go to be able to build a mosque or something. That is the legatee, the person who receives that. The person who is the recipient of the wasiyah is al-Musa lahu, the legatee. And normally, and we'll talk about why it makes sense to be able to do infrastructure projects, sadaqah jariyah projects, things like building a mosque, building a hospital, building schools, building roads, building wells. These kind of things is really useful to be able to do with that because it's also tax deductible. HMRC won't take any of that money because if it's given to a UK registered charity. So that is the recipient of that. The wealth that you have is the stuff that is halal. So if you have anything which isn't Islamic, it cannot be executed. And then the fifth thing that you need within the pillar of the will is the executor of the will. Al-Wasi al-Mukhtar. This is the person who has to be responsible enough to be able to make sure all of this happens. And it's very sensible to have someone who is familiar with UK law, Islamic law, and HMRC policy. The big point here is that the will is effectively offer and acceptance. The testator, you make an offer while you're alive, which you document in your wasiyah. Then when you're dead, that wasiyah is then put in front of the recipient, and it's up to that recipient to accept or refuse. Now, if it's an infrastructure project and a charity, they don't, they'll always accept it. But if it's an individual and they refuse it, then they can't come back and change their mind. And I've also included here stuff about what happens when a will is cancelled, and there's things like someone falling insane, and this is something that is worth a discussion, but we're not going to be able to fit that in this time here. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got all your evidence as well. So that evidence is something that we will. That's evidence that we can go through later. I'm just reading the chat. Okay, good, mashallah. No questions so far. So let's talk about how we determine your assets when you die. So wasiyah comes from the word wasa, which means to order, advise, or promise. Okay, so this is what we do. We get all your wealth. And we're talking about tangible wealth like cash, bank accounts, safety deposits, jewelry, house, land, properties, cars, animals, stock, clothes, books, all of that tangible stuff. But we're also talking about things like any copyrights you've got, any intellectual property you've got, any planning permission you've got. That all is considered part of your assets. So we bundle all that together, and that should be documented in your will. Then we deduct from there people who you owe money to, debts to Allah, kafara, zakah, hajj that is unpaid. We'll take that out from there. Then any pledges that you made, you might have said, I pledged this much money for this many orphans and so forth, that you haven't fulfilled. We do that. Then we return any trusts that you have. Then we deduct all your funeral costs as well. We deduct your funeral costs, the cost of your coffin, the burial, all that kind of stuff. And then any inheritance tax is all deducted. Then we add on to that any money that you are owed by people. So someone might say, I owe him £10,000 here, I'm settling it. So we add that. And now what do? We get a picture of your net assets. Now we have your net assets. From the net assets, you can say none of this is entirely optional, but you can determine that up to 1/3 of this will go to people who you have specified. This must be people that are not entitled to inherit under Sharia. So normally this would be people like an adopted child, if you've got an ex-wife, if you've got non-Muslim relatives, like you've got parents that aren't Muslim, or children that, inshallah, everyone's children are Muslim, or a relative that's not Muslim. So it could be anyone like this. It could be relatives not entitled under Sharia. So you might have a son that's passed away, but his grandchildren aren't entitled. So it may be that you want to give your grandchildren some money. So this is what the wasiyah is. And I would recommend that the wasiyah goes to a UK registered charity for a Sadaqah Jariyah project. That would be my advice to anyone who doesn't have any of these limitations. Then after we've taken this 0 to 1/3, whatever is left, so this could be from 2/3 to the whole amount, that is then specified, that is distributed according to the Sharia. There are 2 exceptions from an Islamic perspective and 4 exceptions from a UK law perspective. The 2 exceptions from an Islamic perspective is that under the Sharia laws, if you have a son or a parent or a relative that's not Muslim, they cannot receive from the Sharia inheritance bucket, but they can receive from the wasiyah bucket. And if somebody kills you, then you can't inherit from them. And this is an important point, especially because in this age of modern science, you might get the question about can we switch off the life support machine? And you say, yeah, I want to switch off the life support machine, and it's determined that you killed the person because you switched it off prematurely or for whatever reason. It means you cannot then inherit from them. So if you switch off your father's life support machine prematurely, and it means according to the Sharia that you've killed them, then you can't inherit from them. So that's an important point to be able to make. and you can't inherit from the Sharia perspective, and you can't inherit from wasiyah. You can't inherit at all. And also from the UK law perspective, there's life insurance policies under Section 166 of the Insurance Act. They can't be inherited. Employee provident funds cannot be. Assets held under joint ownership, they can't be inherited. And a trust created on money payable upon death, that cannot be inherited for legislative reasons. So what does that mean? What does that mean? So what we've determined is who the different people are involved in your will. We've determined that up to one third of your will can be largely discretionary, as long as it's not to the inheritors of the Sharia. And then the bulk of your wealth will be inherited according to the rules of Sharia. Now, these rules of Sharia are going to be a surprise to some people. So I've put the key rules here. So on the left, you can see a diagram which talks about the complexity of it. And you can see why we invented things like algebra and fractions, having the numerator and the denominator separated with a line to be able to deal with this. So we have invented all of that. But that's because it's very complicated. We now are in the day and age where we have got software programs. So if you have a look at the Sharia calculators, and I've included one in the link in the bottom right hand corner, just type that into your URL, and it will produce an inheritance calculator, populate it, and see what it will show you, and then see how you feel about that. Now, there's normally a couple of things that surprise people. One is my son is getting a lot, and my daughters are getting very little. So, how is that unfairly biased towards my son? Because I'd like my daughters to be able to have equal help. I've always treated my children equally. And the other thing is my wife's getting very little. And the third thing is my parents are getting a lot. And I thought my parents were financially stable. They don't need that kind of wealth. What's also quite controversial is that some people say, look, because of this, my wife's not getting that much. I've split the assets. So some of the assets I own, and some of the assets my wife owns. So my wife has got, quite a lot of wealth in her name. But what that means is if she was to die, your in-laws will get that wealth. Your father-in-law would get it, your mother-in-law would get it, maybe even your brother-in-law would get it. So there is people that will end up getting some of that money. And it's just making sure that you're aware of that, and you're not. It's better to understand now what the Sharia distribution will be, rather than when that person dies and then have a big argument about saying, whoa, I didn't realize they were going to get that much money. And it's better to take those measures now in terms of what you can do about it. So now that we've understood these basic pillars, let's talk about some of the problems that you have. And obviously this is an Islamic course which is about solutions. It's not just about listing the problems and just whinging about it. So let's talk about, so the first problem you have is that your wife receives very little, and you don't want her to be destitute. You don't want, your son to be 18 years old, he gets all hot-headed, he gets involved with the wrong type of woman, and then he says, all right, Mom, you're out. I want my new partner to be able to move in, and in this. And the other thing as well is, obviously, we always want the best for our children, and we've tried really hard to be able to bring them up right. But I have seen many examples of people that are older than us, and they're not always Muslims. Sometimes they're quite devout Jews as well. And their children, they grow up and they grow up with very different values, and some of them, they even bring home their life partner and say, "Hey, Mom, I'm gonna live here with my life partner, and you need to find somewhere else to live." That has happened before in a circumstance I'm familiar with. So what can we do with the fact that your wife receives very little? Well, there's two things we do. One is you register your property as a tenancy in common. More about this later, but what that means is that you effectively split the property, all your properties, and it means that you own half and she will own half. So that means when you die, you can only bequeath your half, but her half is ring-fenced for her, and no one can touch that. So that means you can't really kick her out because she owns half of it. The other thing we would do is use a flexible life interest trust. Now, in summary, the way that you minimize your inheritance tax liability, I'll explain this more later, is that you can pass on whatever wealth to your wife tax-free. So you pass all your wealth to your wife tax-free. You pass on all your wealth to your wife tax-free, and she will then distribute it according to the laws of Sharia. so everything is Islamic, and then provided that the wealth is less than £650,000, or she lives for another 7 years, you will pay zero tax. You will pay zero tax. So, if you imagine that, you've got a £2 or £3 million estate and then you're paying zero tax on that, is very attractive. Otherwise, you will be paying, 40% on £3 million estate. You're talking, on anything over £325,000, you're talking close to £1.5 million. And the other thing as well is that there is another point I should have made about the wasiyah. When it comes to that 1/3 that you can give in wasiyah, it's probably useful to cap it, because if you think about that 1/3 in wasiyah, if you have £3 million in assets when you pass away, which isn't foreseeable in this day and age, £3 million is not that much money. 1/3 of that is £1 million, and £1 million going to charity is, it requires a lot of thought. It's not as simple as, here's £50,000 to build a mosque. £1 million is a sizable amount, and it would require a lot of thinking about. So you might want to cap it, or you might want to put in some measures in there. And this is where a flexible life interest trust is quite useful, because you have a bunch of trustees, and then they will have to put a lot of thought, and they'd all have to agree on what is a good use of this money. I've got a message here about brothers are asking whether it's been recorded. It is absolutely, it is being recorded, but YouTube Live is only available for a certain time afterwards. But I am going to put this in a YouTube video and upload it as a summarized version, so it should be there for everyone, because I've had a look around and there isn't anything that brings these three streams together within the UK. I haven't found any material that looks at Islamic law, UK law and tax law and brings them together in one consolidated document. People are either experts in any one domain, but no one's gelled them all together. So I'm going to put all of this and upload it as a YouTube video. So I will do that. So that's the first problem that you have, that your wife receives very little. What do you do about that? So you register it as a tenancy in common and you use a flexible life interest trust. The second problem that you have is that actually your parents will end up receiving a lot of money. In some cases, more than your wife and your daughters. But they're financially secure. What do you do about that? Well, the parents there's nothing stopping the parents gifting back to the children. So the parents can inherit that money and then gift it back to the children, saying, look, we don't really need this. But even if you're worried about that, like it could be your in-laws or you could be on bad terms with your parents, there is something you can do, and not all Muslims agree with this, so there is difference of opinion on this. But what you can do is you can create a debt to your spouse. So you could say, before I die, there's actually a debt to my spouse of £1 million. So that means when you die, the first £1 million will go to your spouse, because she's not treated as a Sharia person, she's treated in the very first bucket as a creditor. So that's what you can do there. The third problem you'll come across is the son receives a lot more than your daughters. Well, you can counter that by giving gifts. You can gift your assets during your lifetime. There is a tapered tax threshold, tax liability with this. So you have, if you survive for 7 years after giving a gift, then it becomes tax-free. But if you die within that 7 years, there's different levels of tax that are applied. So if it's between 0 and 3, you get the highest level of tax. It's 40%, and then it gets progressively smaller the closer you get to 7 years. The fourth problem you have, I've talked about this, you put the wealth in your spouse's name so that your spouse has security when she dies, but then it turns out your in-laws will end up receiving that wealth, so that might be something that you don't want. It could also be, another problem that you have is that the closest member of your family, who is naturally where your children will go to, so if you've got dependent children, if you die and your wife dies, which again is not uncommon, you could have a car accident, you and your wife are in it, you have a plane accident where there's large numbers of your family, what happens to those people that aren't there? So it could be that you and your wife, you're in a car accident, you both die, who's going to raise your children? Well, the state will give it to your closest living relative, but actually that's not who you want, because your closest relative might not be appropriate, they might not be Islamic, their income might be haram. So you actually want it to be someone else, and it could be someone who is back in your country of origin. So you need to stipulate that in your will to make sure that your children are brought up correctly. Another problem you'll come across is that your estate exceeds £325,000, £450,000 if you include your home. Anything above that is taxed at 40%. So this is what I talked about earlier. gift it to your wife, put it in a life interest trust, she bequeaths according to the Sharia, and then therefore you get tax-free. Another problem that you have with this is that, say for example, you don't correctly divorce a previous wife. Yeah, you don't correctly divorce someone. They are now entitled to inherit. If, for example, the two of you fell out, you didn't divorce properly, it happens, and then they will be entitled to come and inherit, and you can't stop them. So the advice here is it's better for you to have that conversation now with the person that you separated with and say, look, I'm just formalizing the divorce so it's there in accordance with the Sharia. I'm formalizing the divorce to stop any of this problem happening. Solve the problems yourself rather than giving it to your children or your inheritors to be able to solve. So, don't you avoid the difficult conversation and let other people have that difficult conversation. You need to clear it up yourself. The next problem that you have is death within 7 years. If you die within 7 years, you will have to pay tax on that. Well, make sure you gift early. Don't leave it right to the last minute to be able to give gifts. Make sure that you gift regularly throughout the year. And keep in mind that gifts to your spouse are exempted. The other problem you'll have is, say, for example, a lot of what we're talking about here relies on your wife taking from you tax-free. Now, if according to English law she is not your wife because you had an Islamic marriage but not a UK civil marriage, you're going to have a problem. So as painful as it is and as bureaucratic as it is, you must go to the registrar and get your marriage registered. If you do not, it is going to create problems later on because your wife's going to try and inherit from you and they're going to say, hey, it's not your wife, you need to pay money. And the last problem that the Sharia wills in the UK will present is that, say for example, and this always happens, someone says, look, my money, just distribute it according to the Sharia. Well, you guys have gone into the Islamic inheritance calculator, you've put in what the numbers look like, and you can see there how many who's going to inherit what, and you can see from there that I think for everyone, when you have a look at it, there's some things in there that make you a little bit uncomfortable. So make sure that you use your wasiha correctly and make sure you understand now who's going to inherit what. So there are the problems with the Islamic laws, and there's some of the solutions. I'm going to now talk about some of those solutions in a little bit more depth to be able to give you a good understanding of them, because what this should be is this should be practical. You should be able to go away and say, I know how I can save £3,000 in legal fees, I need to do this, this and this, and you should be able to just go ahead and do it. You should be able to say, I know how I can save £70,000 in inheritance tax, I need to do A, B and C, and then you should be able to go and do A, B and C. So one of the things I talked about was your properties that you own. They should be as a tenancy in common and not a joint tenancy. If they are in a tenancy in common, what it means is your wife won't get kicked out when you die. It also means that this can go to a flexible life interest trust. If it's not a tenancy in common, if it's a joint tenancy, you can't go into a flexible life interest trust. So it must be a tenancy in common, all of your properties, whatever you have. The difference between a tenancy in common and a joint tenancy is simply both of you share the property. You both effectively own 100% of the property, and it's not mutually exclusive. So what that means is that you die, your wife ends up owning the entire property, or your wife dies, you end up owning the entire property. So actually, when you die, your property isn't part of your inheritance. A tenancy in common says you own 50% and your wife owns 50%. And when you die, you can do whatever with your 50%. And when she dies, she can do whatever with her 50%. That's what a tenancy in common says. To be able to move it to a tenancy in common, this is something you can do yourself. Lawyers will charge about £500 to £1,000 to do this. You don't need to do that. Land Registry are encouraging people to do this stuff themselves. If you follow the 7 steps there, you will be able to do it yourself. All of these recommended articles, the Land Registry have put videos out there saying to people, hey, do this yourself. Don't pay solicitors to do this very basic legal work that needs to be done. They're really helpful. I have done this myself. It is intimidating when you first start looking at it, but the more you look at it, it's pretty straightforward. You should be able to do it in one day. It shouldn't take longer than that. So that's the first thing you need to do. You need to put your properties as tenancies in common and do it all yourself. let's talk about inheritance tax. So these are all the laws about inheritance tax. So I'll summarize them because we don't have long left. Effectively, anything over £325,000 will be paid is taxed at 40%. So £500,000 house, £325,000 tax threshold, boom, £70,000 in tax that you have to pay. Right? It's pretty straightforward. There are some reliefs around business properties and so forth. And there is an exception that if you have a property and it's £450,000 and you leave it for your threshold goes up to £450,000 if you've got a property and you bequeath it to your children. You can give away your home before you die, but you need to have lived for another 7 years, and then you have to pay rent for that property that you are not in. You can give gifts away, but those gifts you have to live for 7 years. So, how do you produce this Sharia-compliant, tax-efficient will? That's what we want. We want a Sharia-compliant, tax-efficient will that's recognized by UK law. How do you produce that? Well, let's have a look at first what happens if you don't produce that. If you don't produce that, what will happen is any assets you and your wife own jointly will go to your wife. Okay? Anything that you don't own jointly, that just you owe, £250,000 of that will go to your wife, and any personal belongings you have will go to your wife. Anything above £250,000, half of it goes to your wife and the other half goes to your children. If you are married and you don't have any children, then your wife gets everything. And if you are unmarried and you don't have any children, then all the wealth goes to the nearest blood relative. And if you don't even have any blood relatives, then the Queen gets it. It goes to the Crown. So they are the rules of the British government on what happens to those people who die without a will. None of this is Sharia compliant. But what it does is it actually sets an expectation that the wife gets the majority of the money. And the Sharia is not of that view. In the Sharia, the wife gets a very small amount. And that's where the arguments start. Inheritance tax, in summary, 40% on anything over £325,000. But assets can go to your wife for free. Anything that goes to your children or to your parents is taxable at 40%. That's over £325,000. If you don't use any of your £325,000 allowance, then your wife can use anything that you didn't use. So on her death, she can have £650,000. So if I die and I give everything to my wife, so I haven't used any of that £325,000 allowance, my wife can then pick up that allowance and make hers up to £650,000. In addition to that, if I get my main family home and I give that either to my children or my stepchildren or even my grandchildren, then I get an additional allowance taking it up to £450,000. So that's the summary of the inheritance tax laws. So what do we do? How do we come up with a Sharia compliant, tax efficient will? Well, we insert a clause into our will, and that clause says I'm going to pass it to my wife, who is going to have immediate post-death interest, and that is to create a flexible life interest trust. So this is the legal jargon that needs to be in there. An immediate post-death interest, which means that you want it in a trust. So you use that ability to pass everything to your wife tax-free, so she takes it. Then you have trustees for this flexible life interest trust, and they will distribute the wealth in accordance to the Sharia. This means if your wife, when she dies, lives for another 7 years, and her estate doesn't exceed 650 grand, it will all be tax-free. It also means your wife is able to live in the property, and it also means that you have some protection around your wealth as well. So I'll come on to, it effectively means that, if you've got a son and he becomes bankrupt, they can go after his wealth, but they can't go after the wealth in the trust because it's ring-fenced. It's ring-fenced separately. So that's effectively how we come up with the Sharia-compliant, tax-efficient will. Other things that you should think about is using gifts regularly, because this is a tax-efficient way of distributing assets. The trust gives you security. So if your son ends up, marrying someone and she's bad news and she's just after the money, well, the trust can contain how the money is released to your son. So it gives you an extra layer of protection. It can give you security because you've got minor children. You know, you can also do like tax efficient loans to those children if you've got a high degree of wealth. You get tax reliefs for business and agricultural property. So if you've got some property that's owned in a business, that becomes tax free. Charity donations, that 1/3 of the wasiyah, if you can give that to charity, that all becomes tax free. Plus, if you get a 10% of if 10% of your overall estate is gifted to charity, then you get even additional tax breaks as a result of that. If you live overseas, you get some very some foreign countries are actually a lot more relaxed on inheritance tax, like India and Pakistan are a lot more generous on inheritance tax. So you may be, if you've got assets distributed globally, you should have a look at those particular countries. I don't know much about the tax laws in those countries to see if there's any additional tax breaks that you can get from that. And then the last thing you can do is a deed of variation. So what that means is that, say for example, you write your will, and then just the year before you die, they introduce some additional tax penalties, and it makes the way that you've distributed your assets not tax efficient. Well, a deed of variation means you can make some adjustments provided that all your trustees agree to be able to make sure that your inheritance is tax efficient. So it allows them to make tweaks to it. So that's effectively how you come up with a Sharia compliant tax efficient will. In summary, if I was to summarize it in a handful of words, your wife inherits everything tax free, distributes according to the Sharia from a flexible life interest trust, and then provided she lives for another 7 years and her wealth doesn't exceed, or her wealth doesn't exceed £650,000, there should be no tax liability. So how do we produce that will? Well, if you just click on that link at the top, or you type that link into your URL, you will get a template will that covers everything that I've talked about. All you need to do is put in your own stuff, put in your own name, address, who the guardian of your children is going to be, what assets that you've got, and inshallah that's pretty much it. If you fill that out, you will be able to take advantage of all the things I've talked about, the tax breaks, the compliance to UK law, the compliance to Sharia law, not being sinful by not having a will for more than 2 days. It's quite just as simple as typing that link in, accessing that document, and putting in your own personal details. Obviously, if you have a lot more wealth, and just to be a lot more diligent about it, you should get it checked out by a lawyer. But I've had that will checked by a number of different people, and it probably is due a renewal now. But it's certainly better than nothing, and it would work. It would work. It's not the best will, but it's certainly something that is compliant. Let's talk about power of attorney. So this is what happens. Say, for example, you become incapacitated. So that means you've had a car accident, you can't think for yourself. Someone needs to make decisions about your wealth, passwords, bank accounts, all that kind of stuff. And someone needs to make a decision about your health. Do we resuscitate him? Do we put him in a home? What kind of medical attention is he allowed to have and not allowed to have? So this can be quite difficult, especially if you get something like dementia, where you are alive but you've got very little, you've got very little understanding of what's going on around you, and it becomes very hard to do this once you are suffering from an illness. You can't say this person has now got dementia, this person's gone crazy, and now we want him to sign lasting power of attorney because, well, he's insane, he can't sign it. So it's better that you do this now. Lawyers will charge you £500 to £1,000 to do it. Just do it yourself. Very simple. You just go onto the website. I've put a website in there. I've put registering your LPA right at the bottom. Gov.uk, power of attorney. Just go in there, fill out 2 forms. 1 form for you for your health. 1 form for you for your wealth. 1 form for your wife for her health. 1 form for your wife for her wealth. So health and wealth for husband and wife, 4 forms. Fill them out. There's a registration fee of £82 each. If you went to a lawyer, if they charge £250 each, that's £1,000 to be able to do it. You don't need to pay that money. What it will do is it will give you that degree of protection. So now that we've gone through a whistle-stop tour of this course. Like I said, this is probably a 3 to 6 hour course normally, where we would normally go through each slide, make sure everyone understands it before moving on to the next one. So we have gone through it quite quickly, but I understand everyone is quite time pressured, so I've gone through it in 45 minutes. But if all of that is too much, in summary, what you should do is, now that you've done this course, go and register for lasting power of attorney. Do property and affairs and health and welfare, 1 for you, 2 for you, and 2 for your wife. So you do that. That, I think, is a good place to start, because this will get you used to filling out forms and registering them and so forth. And so that's once you've done that, you'll build up your confidence a bit. The second thing you should do is that Islamic will template that I gave. Just take that, put in your own personal details, and then great, you've got a will. That's tax efficient, UK compliant, Sharia compliant. Alhamdulillah, done. The third thing that you should do is look at what I've talked about in terms of inheritance tax planning. Do you know what your current tax liability is at the moment? Your flexible life interest trust, do you know how that's going to be set up? What kind of trustees would you have on that? Just dot the I's and cross the T's to be able to make sure that you have confidence that you're not going to be paying any inheritance tax or minimizing your inheritance tax liability. The fourth thing you should do is that one slide where I talked about how you take your properties to a tenancy in common instead of a joint tenancy. Just go through those 7 steps, and inshallah you will have all your properties as tenancy in common. And this is a prerequisite for a flexible life interest trust, and will also mean that your wife doesn't get kicked out if you die. The fifth thing that you should all do is you should register your marriage. Please go and register your marriage. I know it's humiliating going there and being, registering your marriage, and you've got married 10 years and you've got 2 or 3 beautiful children, mashallah, it's great. And, you're like, well, if you're saying I'm married now, what are you saying about my children who are 10 years old? You're going to call them the most awful names. It is humiliating, but just go and do it, because what you don't want is your wife to be hit with a tax bill when she takes your money because they say that's not your wife. And the last thing you should do is you should update your will after every 5 years, because they do change legislation quite frequently. Just today, I don't know if, I'm one of those boring people that generally tend to watch boring stuff, but Theresa May just announced today that she's going to do a new level of stamp duty for foreign buyers, because they want to deter them. So there'll be a new stamp duty for foreign buyers, and that's going to be fed back in to help those people who are displaced or homeless. So legislation does change quite frequently, so a will should be updated after every 5 years or so. And then this is just a last thing, which is more boring stuff, which is about us, who we are, effectively. So my motivations here, and the motivations of the Cabal as well, who helped set this up. This is not about kind of making any money or calling to a madhab or calling to any Islamic way of thinking. This is just simply about getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah, Allah is pleased with us. That's the only motivation here. There is nothing beyond that. And Allah forgive us if ever there is any kind of motivation which is beyond that. And it's simply to try and get closer to Allah and to encourage other people to get closer to Allah. And that's the only thing that we ask for. We don't ask for anything else. So please do make dua for everyone who helped participate and put this course together. And that concludes the course. That's a whistle-stop tour of the 3 to 6 hour course, done in about 50 minutes. I'll have a look to see if there is any questions on the chat. So let's have a look. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Say your name to one. Planning permission too. Yes, planning permission too. Yes, because planning permission is an asset that you have. Mahbooba said, Assalamu alaikum. What if the executor of the will expired after deceased in short span? Do we need to back up plan on more than one? Yes, you do. So if you have a look at the template will, what I've done is I've put, you can nominate 4 people as an executor, 4 people as a guardian, 4 people as a trustee. Because if the first one isn't there, who's the second one and who's the third one? The 4th person you should always put down is sorry, let me just move it back to this. So the 4th person that you should put down is the local imam, because it could be that you pass away, inshallah, maybe in Medina or somewhere like that, and then you say the local imam is going to be the executor. So inshallah, you never know, it could be in Masjid al-Haram that you get your janazah done, and maybe even get buried in Jannat al-Baqi. So yeah, I have put 4 people within the will, the 4th person being the nearest imam. The next question, there are often cases where the claimants say that the will is invalid due to various reasons. How can we make it watertight? So if you have a look at the slide which talks about the reasons for cancellation of a will, one of them is that the person goes insane before they pass away. That is a problem. That is a problem. Making a will watertight is difficult because you don't want it to be too specific that it ties people's hands and it's not flexible to accommodate changing legislation. So you don't want it to be overly specific that it becomes cumbersome. I've seen some wills that are like, bury me in this way and put 3 handfuls of dirt over my, very explicit. It's better just to say do it in accordance to the sunnah. Okay. A quick rundown of the slides is what I've been asked for, so inshallah I'll come on to that. So don't be overly specific, don't try and make it watertight, but what's more important is to make sure you have a very good executor. Have a very good executor, because that executor is someone who should be able to work with people and make sure that your inheritors get the best out of it, and more importantly that you get the best out of it. One of the things that really hit me when I was, whenever I come and look at this, is that it's hard enough to earn the money, and it's sometimes hard enough to be able to spend the money in a halal way. It is also very difficult to bequeath that money in an Islamic way as well, and it will require sacrifice. So yes, as hard as you have worked to earn the money and as hard as you work to spend that money Islamically, make sure we work just as hard to bequeath that money Islamically. Can we put conditions on will for shareholders who have a right from Sharia point, e.g. a disobedient son? No, you cannot. You cannot. Allah has said that this is the person who's going to get that wealth. So as long as your son is Muslim, he will is entitled to inherit that money, and there's nothing you can do about it. Karamat Muhammad says, how about outside UK where laws goes against the Islamic Sharia? Is there a possibility for making a private will? Will it work? I'm not sure I understand that question. How about outside? So where laws go... So UK laws go against the Islamic Sharia. You'd have to mention a specific country to me. So I'm familiar with legislation in the UK and the US, and both of those respect people's individual beliefs. So both of these two countries, you can make an Islamic will, and provided that it's structured correctly, you will ensure that it is tax efficient, Sharia compliant, and recognised by the UK law. So I've been asked as well to just give a quick recap of each one of the slides. So inshallah, I'll do that. So objectives, if we go back to the objectives, inshallah, this course brought you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second one, it was to make significant savings in legal fees. So inshallah, I've told you how you can save thousands of pounds in legal fees. I've also told you how you can save tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands in inheritance tax liability. So you should be equipped with that knowledge. Inshallah, you've learnt about the Islamic rules regarding inheritance. So this is the wasiyah, which is 0 to 1/3 of your wealth. And then it's the balance, which is distributed according to what Sharia says. I've told you about fulfilling your Islamic obligation by producing a will. So I've given you the template of a will that will give you a Sharia compliant, UK law compliant, and tax efficient will. The fifth objective was to give the right person legal authority for your health and wealth. So this is the lasting power of attorney. I've given you options around inheritance tax planning. So there's the slides on what the inheritance tax is, and what you can do about avoiding that in terms of your flexible life interest trust and giving away gifts, and also to remove ambiguity by minimizing disputes when you pass away. So they were the objectives. Inshallah, I hope we fulfill the objectives. If we haven't, you can feel free to come through Iqbal and say, hey, I didn't really understand this quite well. So I'll just do a whistle-stop tour on the just a brief summary of the slides. This slide was the evidences on why it's important. This slide talked about what it has meant for mankind, the Islamic laws on Sharia, and I go back to my point earlier. This whole thing that I've covered is just taken 2 verses of Quran and explored them in more detail. And inshallah, I really hope this has shown you the miraculous nature of Quran, where just 2 verses from Quran have spawned this really complicated field. And the amazing thing is, the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have stood up to all this modern complex UK tax legislation and UK civil legislation. The laws of Sharia have stood up in face of all of these modern technologies, which means that this isn't just some kind of desert law revealed to the Arabs 1400 years ago. These are two verses that spawned algebra, that spawned fractions, and that are equitable and applicable today. This slide talks about the effectively five pillars that you've got of a will, but ultimately it's an offer and acceptance, and that there is a difference between inheritance and wasiyah. Wasiyah is your discretionary spend, which is 0 to a third, and then the Sharia inheritance is something that you don't get a choice over. That's what Allah ordained. This slide talks about how you go from your assets to your net assets, the wasiyah, which is the 0 to 1/3, and then the Sharia inheritance, and all the steps that are involved in that, and what we do. And I talk here as well about the difference between a gift and a will, and what can't be inherited. There's actually one point I should make on this, that there's a question that was asked about, what kind of things do you get the dispute over. So if you look at the box there that talks about the cancellation of a will, you can see that it's if the testator revokes his will, or if he becomes insane after making the will, these are all the things that can make it cancelled, and this is the thing that causes a lot of dispute. So it's important to be aware of these. This slide talks about the realization of what your will look like, if your wealth will look like if it's inherited according to the Sharia, and it introduces the Sharia calculator. This slide lists the 12 challenges that you have with modern day with wills in this country, and a solution to each one of those problems. This slide talks about how you move your property from a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common, and the 7 steps to do that. These 2 slides talked about the UK inheritance tax laws. This slide talked about what happens if you don't make a will. And this slide talked about how you produce a Sharia-compliant tax-efficient will. This slide said if you click on this link, you will get your template will. So we introduced the template will here. This slide talked about how you register lasting power of attorney for health and wealth for you and for your wife. And then we had the next steps. This is what, if all of it is too much to take and you need to figure out what's the call to action? What do I need to do now? Well, these are the 6 things that you need to do now. And then this one was a little bit about us. So inshallah, there's some more questions. Karamaf, feel free to elaborate your question. He's worrying about private. In any other countries like China, they may force inheritance in another way, which may be against Islamic. I don't know much about China, if I'm honest. If what you're saying here is in China they force inheritance, yeah, I don't know. That's pretty brutal if you're forcing people to force inheritance like that. But the scope of this is really about UK law. I know a bit about US law, so a lot of this is applicable to US law as well. So that concludes our hour, inshallah. I hope, pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this has been beneficial for you. If anyone does want any kind of probing in certain areas, feel free to take it through Iqbal and Dr. Mujahid, who help facilitate this. We'll finish in the name of Allah. وَقُولِ قَوْلِ هَذَا وَأَسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ اللَّهُمَّ اغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ سُبْحَانَكَ إِنِّي كُنْتُ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ وقال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتاب الكريم والفرقان المجيد والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.